Last week we saw a great game in Copa del Rey. Atletico Madrid completely outplayed Barcelona. I can say that I never saw them that much vulnerable. Barcelona will have impossible mission at Camp Nou. So what were tactics from both sides? When Flick's side was in possession in their third of the pitch, they lined up in a 4-2-3-1 formation, but Koundé was more conservative compared to Balde, so we can say that Barcelona operated with lopsided back three. We are all familiar with Simeone's trademark 4-4-2 zonal-oriented shape, but in this match Atletico was much more man-oriented. Barcelona's asymmetrical back three could mean that Atletico's front two are overloaded. But the Argentinian manager was aware of that, so he instructed Lookman to press Koundé. That will mean that Flick's side is now forced to go long since there is 3v3. And there is one more thing that is important to highlight. 4-2-3-1 naturally has numerical advantage in the midfield, and we saw how Barcelona took advantage of this in the previous meeting between these sides. However, Atletico adapted their press. In this game, Koke, Llorente and Simeone went man-on-man in the midfield. The only free player will be fullback, but Atletico compensated for this. When Cubarsí had the ball, the front line would not press all of the centre-backs at the same time. Instead of that, Lookman will stay a little bit deeper, which was pressing trap. Since Garcia is covered, the only free option is Koundé, and the moment it was clear that the ball is going to French right back, Lookman started with the press. That left Koundé without the option every time. This was the way Atletico got man-on-man against the opponent's backline and midfield despite being overloaded 7v6. Hansi Flick responded by playing goalkeeper Garcia as centre-back. That allowed Eric Garcia to play as left-back and to create wide overload. Believe it or not, this didn't help Barcelona. Atletico just continued with their pressing shape. Alvarez was marking Cubarsí, Lookman was marking Koundé, Griezmann was marking Eric Garcia, while the midfielders stayed man-on-man. Barcelona's players on the left flank operated in close proximity, and Atletico Madrid was primarily focused on marking closer players. Lookman stayed a little bit deeper than front two, so Atletico continued with pressing trap. This situation meant that it's much easier to pass to Koundé than to try to get advantage of overload. And there is one more thing. Barcelona's wide players operating in close proximity enabled Simeone to take hybrid position and mark two players at once. And this was the way Atletico forced Barcelona to play to Koundé instead of trying to get advantage over wide overload. Having in mind that Atletico is playing man-on-man defense, the young would drop deeper to force Simeone to track him. This should create space for Balde to receive the ball since Molina is pinned by right winger. However, instead of following De Jong, Simeone stayed closer to Balde, while Griezmann marked Dutch midfielder. When Eric Garcia received the ball, Griezmann was still more concentrated on De Jong, but he could make a little bit of pressure on him. This created a situation where Garcia has no real options. All three midfielders are marked, while Simeone was close to Balde. Ferran Torres could drop to create third-man combination, and this could help Barcelona, but Pubil was too aggressive. And in the end, Flick's side had hard time playing third-man combination. There was one very hidden disadvantage of playing goalkeeper Garcia as centre-back. When Blaugrana progressed higher on the pitch after Garcia played as centre-back, Cubarsí needed to track Alvarez since Eric Garcia was marking Griezmann and Argentinian played closer to Griezmann than Lookman. As you can spot, there is a big distance between Cubarsí and Koundé, and Barcelona was really vulnerable on defensive transition, and Lookman was ready to exploit that gap. When Barcelona advanced with the ball, Atletico defended in man-oriented zonal system. Man-oriented zonal defending is when every player has zone where he is operating, but his focus is the opposition's player in that zone. Their movements are related to their opponent, not to their teammate. Atletico still operated in lopsided 4-3-3 formation. When Koundé had the ball, Lookman will apply pressure while Griezmann and Alvarez stayed a little bit deeper, because if they stay close to centre-backs, it will open the space in the midfield. Instead, they waited the moment where it was certain that the ball will go to center back and then they will apply pressure on him. They were focused on protecting the center and forcing Barcelona to play wide. You remember when I mentioned that Balde is free man? Since midfield is man-on-man and Atletico is pressing with 3 players in the front line, it meant that Blaugrana has numerical advantage in that horizontal line of the pitch. When Koundé or Cubarsí were with the ball in their feet, Simeone, Koke and Llorente were marking De Jong, Fermin and Casado. Since there was direct pressure on the player with the ball, while Griezmann was a little bit deeper, the only safe option was to play to Garcia. And the same second it was obvious that the ball would go to Garcia, Simeone would position himself closer to Balde, which made him ready to apply pressure. It was clear that it would create a midfield overload for Barcelona, so Koke was fast to track De Jong. Alvarez would drop to mark Casado, which allowed Llorente to stay close to Fermin in the case of a long ball. And Ruggeri could stay on Yamal. This was the system that allowed Atleti to prevent midfielders from receiving the ball while applying pressure on Balde. As you can see, Griezmann stayed close to Eric Garcia, so there was no real option for Barcelona. In the past 2 seasons we saw how lethal Flick's team is when they are using opposing movements. When Balde had the ball, De Jong will attack left half space. Since Atletico was man-on-man in the midfield, it was a question for Koke, will he track the Dutch midfielder all over. At the same time, Olmo could drop deeper to create advantage and receive the ball. However, the communication between Atletico's players was excellent. Molina and Koke could easily exchange the players and it will prevent Olmo from receiving the ball in the free space. As the game progressed, De Jong and Casado started to drop deeper to create advantage over Atleti's front line. That had some knock-on effects. First of all, Barcelona now had just 1 midfielder, so Olmo started dropping deeper to compensate. One of Atletico's centre-backs followed him to some point. Also, since Barcelona didn't have much players in the midfield, Simeone was now free to move wider to mark Balde. Alvarez dropped to be sure that De Jong doesn't have easy time receiving the ball. Griezmann took hybrid position, he was ready to press Eric Garcia, but also he was there in case Alvarez couldn't track De Jong. Also, Lookman took some kind of hybrid position where he stayed closer to Casado, while he also signaled to Cubarsí that he is also ready to press Koundé. If, for example, Lookman stayed closer to Koundé, Llorente needed to stay higher to mark Casado, and that will mean that Fermin is now free to receive the ball. However, it was not the case, so Lookman stayed a little bit deeper. On the occasions where Casado was able to receive the ball, Fermin would drag wider and Olmo would shift to the right side. But Atletico Madrid had the answer for this. First of all, Lookman would cover Fermin Lopez until Llorente arrived to mark him. Now Koke was free to track Olmo, while Pubil could go back to his position. As the game progressed, Olmo started dropping deeper more frequently. When Eric Garcia received the ball, Olmo would create 2v1 advantage with Balde against Simeone. However, Atletico Madrid had answer for this. Simeone's task was to aggressively press Balde, while Molina needed to step up to track Olmo's vertical runs. Alvarez was deeper and he was close to Casado and ready to block the possible pass to him. It's important to mention Griezmann's positioning. He was adding even more pressure on Balde, while being more than ready to apply pressure on Eric Garcia. Also, his positioning meant that he is preventing a possible pass to Cubarsí, since Alvarez is marking Casado. Llorente was there to patrol down the center of the pitch and help Alvarez or Koke to win the ball back. In these situations, Fermin was free, but it was exceptionally hard for Balde to play the ball to him. Instead, he was forced to play backwards and Griezmann was ready to press the center-back. There was one very hidden advantage of Atletico's way of pressing. I already mentioned that just one of their front 3 is pressing his player and the other 2 are waiting the pass to their man. That was the way of protecting the center and it forced the backline to play short passes between each other without hurting the opposition. However, This way of positioning of the attackers meant that they are much closer to midfield compared to center-backs, and if the ball went to winger, the fullback could track him, and since Barca's winger is now turned with his back to Atleti's goal, there was no danger of passing forward. And the front line was fast to apply ball-oriented pressure, and Barcelona's players were overloaded in that part of the pitch. So far, we talked about tactics from both sides when Barcelona had the ball in possession. Now, we will briefly discuss tactics when Atletico Madrid had the ball. From the goal kick, they operated with just 3 players in the backline, formed by goalkeeper and 2 center-backs. Fullbacks pushed pretty much higher and they stayed wide, hugging the sideline. Llorente and Koke stayed closer to their goal compared to fullbacks. Barcelona pressed in their trademark 4-2-4 formation, but it was ineffective in this match. Positioning of Molina and Ruggeri meant that Koundé and Olmo needed to stay deeper and track Atleti's fullbacks. That created a situation where Barcelona is pressing with only 2 players. Hansko was the player taking goal kicks, and the idea was to play short to Musso because now Yamal and Torres can't force the play to the one side of the pitch. For example, if Musso took the goal kick and played to Hansko, now Barcelona could force him to play to the left side of the pitch. But this wasn't the case. When ball went to Musso, Yamal and Torres would start the press. Koke would follow Ferran Torres, and De Jong was hesitant to go higher on the pitch and mark Koke. There was a reason for this. If De Jong followed Koke, it will grow the space between the lines, and if ball went to Simeone, 6 Barcelona players would be cutted out of play easily. But wait a second, it was even worse for Flick's team. Lookman dropped to create 2v1 advantage with Ruggeri against Koundé. Things were even worse if we look at Ferran's pressing. He wasn't able to leave Pubil in his cover shadow, but also there was a possible pass to Koke. Using third man combination, ball was played to Pubil, who had a lot of space to progress the ball. De Jong was again 2v1 down. In the end, it was more than deserved victory for Atletico Madrid. Since it's not possible to mention every detail of the game, drop in the comments what you noticed in this match.